60 days was all it took to erase a marriage the world once believed was unbreakable. In New York City, headlines didn't hesitate, they celebrated it. Ryan Mitchell stood under the soft lights of a luxury Manhattan venue, his hand confidently wrapped around Emily Carter's, the woman tabloids called his perfect upgrade. Cameras flashed as if rewriting history in real time, capturing every smile as proof that the past had been successfully replaced. No one mentioned Eva Johnson anymore, as if her name had quietly fallen out of existence the moment the divorce papers were signed. But Eva had not vanished. She had simply stopped belonging to the version of the story Ryan controlled. 3 weeks earlier, she had walked out of the apartment they once called home without a scene, without raised voices, only the sound of a door closing behind her with finality. Ryan had called it closure. To him, it was clean, efficient, necessary. To Eva, it was something else entirely, the moment she stopped being visible inside someone else's ambition. That same evening, while Ryan finalized engagement announcements with Emily, Eva sat alone in a quiet apartment on the opposite side of the city, watching the news scroll across her phone screen. There was no trembling, no anger, only stillness, like a decision already made long before the world caught up. What Ryan never understood was that Eva Johnson had never been dependent on the life he thought he provided. Years before the marriage, she had already been embedded in systems he never noticed, contracts, advisory structures, quiet strategic decisions that shaped more than one rising career in their industry. But none of that mattered to him anymore. Not yet. Because in Ryan's mind, the story had already ended exactly the way he wanted it to end. Emily Carter was the present, polished and public. Eva Johnson was the past, neatly archived and forgotten. And somewhere between those two beliefs, a silence was forming, one that would not stay silent for long. Because in the city that never erased anything permanently, silence was never the end of a story, it was only the pause before exposure. And what Ryan Mitchell dismissed as closure had already begun shifting in places he could not see, where names were not forgotten, only reassigned to a different level of power. Everything was already in motion beneath Manhattan's surface. The morning after the public celebration that placed Ryan Mitchell at the center of every social headline felt almost rehearsed, as if the city itself had accepted the version of reality he wanted everyone to believe. His schedule was filled with congratulatory messages, investment calls, and curated interviews that framed his new life as a seamless continuation of success. Emily Carter moved through it all with practiced ease, adjusting the cameras, conversations, and appearances that painted them as the ideal modern couple. Yet beneath the polished surface, every interaction carried the quiet weight of performance, as if they were both aware that attention could be earned but not always trusted to last. Across the city, Eva Johnson moved through a completely different rhythm of life, one that no longer required validation from anyone who had once defined her value. She lived in a quieter space now, not marked by absence but by intention, where every hour was shaped by decisions that belonged only to her. The apartment she occupied was simple, overlooking the steady movement of New York traffic, where everything felt temporary except the choices being made behind closed doors in corporate rooms she no longer publicly entered. What most people did not know was that Eva had not stepped away from influence, she had stepped away from visibility. In the days following the wedding announcement, subtle changes began appearing in professional networks tied to Ryan Mitchell's industry. Access requests that once passed without question now required additional review. Strategic communications between partner firms shifted tone, becoming more formal, more precise, as if unseen hands were adjusting the flow of information. Ryan noticed none of it, or perhaps he chose not to. His focus remained on expansion, branding, and reinforcing the image of a man who had successfully closed one chapter and upgraded to another. Emily supported that narrative publicly, smiling for cameras, attending scheduled events, and ensuring their presence remained constant in media cycles. Then came the invitation that changed nothing on the surface but altered everything beneath it. A private business gathering hosted in Manhattan, reserved for select figures in finance, technology, and international investment. Ryan saw it as another opportunity to reinforce his standing. Emily saw it as a stage where their new identity would be validated. Neither of them expected Eva Johnson's name to appear on the guest list, not as a feature, not as a guest of honor, but as someone listed under confidential advisory access. Ava received the invitation without reaction. There was no surprise, no hesitation, only a quiet acknowledgement that certain paths eventually circle back, not out of emotion, but out of structure. On the evening of the event, as city lights reflected across glass towers, Eva entered the venue not as someone returning to the world she left behind, but as someone stepping into a layer of it that had always existed beyond visibility. Conversations paused in subtle shifts of attention, not because she demanded it, but because presence sometimes carried weight without explanation. At the same time, Ryan arrived with Emily, confident in the familiarity of recognition that usually followed him into such rooms. But this time, something was different. The room did not respond to him in the same way. Conversations remained measured, acknowledgments more controlled. And at the far end of the space, a man known only in financial circles as Marcus Reynolds observed quietly, his attention settling on Eva not with curiosity alone, but with recognition that suggested prior knowledge rather than chance encounter. In that moment, while Ryan continued moving through a world he believed he understood, something else began forming in the background, a shift not yet spoken, but already in motion beneath the surface of every polished conversation in the room. The atmosphere inside the Manhattan private gathering shifted in ways that were almost imperceptible at first, like a change in pressure that only certain people in the room seemed able to feel. Conversations continued, glasses were raised, and polite laughter moved across clusters of influential guests, but attention had quietly begun to drift toward the far side of the venue where Eva Johnson stood with a calmness that did not invite explanation. She was not speaking, not seeking recognition, simply present in a way that felt different from the roles people usually assigned to her past. Ryan Mitchell noticed her almost by accident while speaking with a group of investors, and for a brief moment his confidence hesitated, not because she had done anything visible, but because she had not reacted to him at all. Emily Carter followed his gaze and quickly adjusted her expression, maintaining the composed image she had learned to protect in public settings, yet something in the room no longer aligned with the version of control they had expected to maintain. At the same time, Marcus Reynolds stood slightly apart from the center of conversation, his attention already fixed on Eva in a way that suggested he was not discovering her for the first time but confirming something he had already understood. When Eva finally moved forward through the space, it was not dramatic, not announced, but it carried a natural certainty that subtly shifted how people made room for her without realizing it. Ryan attempted to re-establish familiarity when she came within distance, offering a polite greeting that carried the weight of old assumptions about who she had been in his life, but Eva responded only with a brief nod, her focus not lingering on him long enough to reopen anything from the past. The exchange lasted only seconds, yet it left a visible gap in the rhythm of the room, as if a conversation that once defined her identity had been quietly closed without permission for debate. Marcus then approached, and the tone of the environment shifted again, not through words but through recognition from others in the room who adjusted their posture slightly as he entered closer proximity. He did not introduce himself with emphasis, nor did he attempt to command attention, yet the silence around him became structured, intentional, as if people were subconsciously aligning themselves with his presence. He looked at Eva and addressed her directly, using her full name in a way that suggested awareness of her beyond the surface level others had reduced her to. Ryan watched this interaction from a short distance, slowly realizing that the attention Eva was receiving was not social curiosity but something closer to professional acknowledgement. Emily's expression tightened subtly as she tried to interpret the shift in status that was unfolding without explanation. Marcus spoke a few more words to Eva, referencing a scheduled discussion that had not been publicly announced, and Eva responded with calm precision, confirming her awareness without offering unnecessary detail. In that exchange, there was no emotional display, only alignment, as if two independent paths had quietly intersected at a point that had been calculated long before this evening. Ryan remained still, his earlier confidence now replaced with a growing awareness that the structure of the room was no longer reflecting his presence in the way it had at the beginning of the night. Conversations resumed around him, but they no longer centered on him in the same way. Instead, subtle attention patterns had shifted toward Marcus and Eva, as if the underlying importance of the gathering had been quietly reassigned without announcement. In that moment, the illusion of control that had defined Ryan's recent success began to feel less stable, not through confrontation, but through absence of reinforcement, and for the first time that evening, he found himself observing rather than being observed. The silence that followed Marcus Reynolds' introduction to Eva Johnson did not last long, but it changed the texture of the entire room in a way that was difficult to reverse. Conversations continued, yet they no longer carried the same effortless confidence they had earlier in the evening. People adjusted their tone, their posture, even the distance between themselves and the center of attention, as if the room had subtly reorganized its hierarchy without announcing it. Ryan Mitchell remained near the edge of a conversation that no longer anchored itself around him, listening more than speaking for the first time in the night. Emily Carter stood beside him, maintaining her composed expression, but her attention was no longer fully aligned with the social rhythm she had been carefully participating in across the room. Eva Johnson remained calm, her presence steady, not seeking influence, yet naturally drawing it through recognition that did not require explanation. Marcus Reynolds stood beside her with a quiet familiarity that suggested prior understanding, and when he spoke again, it was not performative, but precise, referencing an upcoming strategic review connected to international investment structures. Ava responded with equal precision, confirming details without hesitation, as if this conversation was not new but part of a continuity that others were only now beginning to notice. Ryan's attention sharpened at certain words he did not fully understand, particularly references to advisory alignment and institutional coordination, terms that did not belong to the social environment he had expected to dominate that evening. He glanced toward Emily, but she offered no clarity, only a controlled expression that suggested she was also recalibrating her understanding of what was unfolding. Meanwhile, subtle reactions began to spread through nearby groups of guests, not through open conversation but through observation, as people attempted to interpret the shift in attention toward Eva and Marcus without drawing direct conclusions. Marcus then made a brief gesture toward a quieter section of the venue, indicating that the discussion could continue in a more private setting. Eva followed without urgency, her movement unhurried but deliberate, and as she did, several attendees instinctively stepped aside, not out of instruction, but out of awareness that certain conversations were no longer meant to remain in public flow. Ryan watched this transition with a growing sense of distance from the structure he had entered confidently earlier in the night. The gathering had not changed its location or its purpose, yet its internal logic had begun to reorganize itself around individuals he had previously considered peripheral. Emily finally spoke quietly to him, suggesting they engage with other guests, but her voice carried a subtle uncertainty that reflected the broader shift in the room's atmosphere. At the same time, Eva and Marcus reached a more private section overlooking the city skyline, where the background noise of the event softened into distant echoes. Marcus reviewed a sequence of details regarding upcoming financial transitions, mentioning timelines and confirmations that suggested coordinated movement across multiple institutional levels. Ava listened without interruption, her responses brief but exact, confirming her continued alignment with processes that extended beyond immediate visibility. There was no emotional emphasis in their exchange, only structural clarity, as if both understood that the conversation was about systems rather than moments. Back in the main hall, Ryan attempted to regain conversational footing with a group of investors, but he noticed that their attention intermittently drifted toward the area where Eva had moved, as if something unresolved had been introduced into the environment. He adjusted his tone, attempting to reassert familiarity and relevance, but the responses he received were measured, polite, and increasingly non-committal. For the first time, he experienced the unsettling realization that recognition in the room was no longer guaranteed by presence alone. Emily observed him closely now, her earlier confidence replaced by a more cautious awareness of how quickly perception could shift in environments driven by influence rather than familiarity. As the evening progressed, Marcus concluded the private exchange with Eva by acknowledging that certain confirmations would become visible in upcoming industry channels, though the details would remain initially framed within procedural language. Ava acknowledged this without reaction, as if the outcome had already been accounted for long before the conversation took place. When she returned toward the main space, the room subtly adjusted again, not because of announcement, but because of awareness. Ryan saw her re-enter and instinctively tried to interpret her role in the environment he still believed he understood, but the structure of that understanding had already begun to dissolve quietly around him, replaced by something more complex that no longer centered on his perspective. They returned to the main hall brought a different kind of silence, not absence of sound but absence of certainty, as if the atmosphere itself had been subtly reorganized while no one was openly acknowledging it. Ava Johnson moved through the space with steady composure, her presence no longer blending into the background in the way it once might have, yet still carrying no need for announcement or validation. Conversations around her continued, but their rhythm had shifted, becoming more measured, more observant, as if people were recalculating how to position themselves within an environment that no longer behaved predictably. Ryan Mitchell noticed this change immediately upon seeing her re-enter, though he could not identify the exact point at which perception had shifted. He attempted to re-engage with a group of attendees, speaking with controlled confidence about ongoing ventures and future plans, but the responses he received were increasingly polite in a way that created distance rather than connection. Emily Carter remained beside him, her posture composed, yet her attention occasionally drifting toward Ava's position in the room, reflecting a quiet awareness that something foundational had changed in how influence was distributed within the gathering. Across the space, Marcus Reynolds resumed conversation with several senior figures, but his attention periodically returned to Ava, not in a manner that sought approval, but in one that suggested alignment with an unseen framework already in motion. When Ava finally crossed toward a quieter section of the venue, the movement itself caused subtle adjustments in surrounding behavior, as guests unconsciously opened space without being asked. Rajan observed this from a distance, his earlier confidence now replaced by a more analytical awareness that the environment was no longer responding to him with the same consistency. For the first time, he was no longer at the center of interpretation but part of the audience interpreting others. Emily leaned slightly toward him and mentioned the possibility of leaving early, but her voice lacked the certainty it once carried earlier in the evening. Meanwhile, Ava met Marcus again near a section of the venue where city lights filtered through tall glass panels, casting structured reflections across polished surfaces. Marcus spoke briefly about a pending alignment within international investment frameworks, referencing timing that suggested coordinated movement across multiple institutions. Ava responded in a calm, controlled manner, confirming understanding without elaboration, as if each piece of information was simply part of a system she already knew how to navigate. There was no visible emotional reaction, only recognition of structure and timing. Rajan, watching from a distance, struggled to reconcile this version of Ava with the one he believed had been defined by his past decisions. The gap between those perceptions widened with each passing moment, not through confrontation, but through absence of familiarity. Conversations around him continued to evolve, but the subjects increasingly shifted toward broader financial and structural developments rather than social familiarity or personal connection. He noticed names and references he did not fully understand appearing in dialogue surrounding Marcus, suggesting layers of influence that extended beyond the social setting into institutional frameworks. Emily observed this as well, her earlier confidence replaced by a more careful awareness of how quickly environments could shift when attention consolidated around individuals with unseen authority. At one point, Marcus briefly acknowledged Rajan's presence in a polite but distant manner, as if recognizing him only as part of the surrounding environment rather than a participant of equal relevance. That moment registered quietly, but firmly, in Rajan's perception. Ava remained composed throughout, her attention never lingering unnecessarily on any one individual, as if her focus had already moved beyond the dynamics of the room. When she eventually exited toward a quieter corridor leading away from the main hall, Marcus followed at a measured pace, leaving behind a room that continued to function but no longer felt centered around its original assumptions. Rajan remained still for several seconds after watching them leave, processing not a confrontation, but a recalibration of everything he thought had been stable. The evening continued, yet the structure of meaning within it had already shifted irreversibly, leaving him in a position where observation replaced control, and certainty had begun to dissolve into something far less predictable. The corridor leading away from the main hall carried a different kind of silence, one that felt less like emptiness and more like transition, as if the energy of the evening had been pulled into a narrower space where decisions were no longer shaped by social presence but by structure and intent. Ava Johnson walked with steady composure beside Marcus Reynolds, their pace unhurried, their movement aligned without needing coordination through words. Being them, the distant sound of the gathering continued, but it now felt separated, almost like a different system operating on a lower frequency of relevance. Marcus broke the silence first, his tone calm and precise as he referenced an internal update regarding a pending institutional alignment across multiple investment channels. He spoke without emphasis, as if the information was already understood at a level beyond explanation, and Eva responded in the same controlled manner, confirming awareness without adding unnecessary detail. There was no emotional fluctuation in their exchange, only clarity, as if both were operating within a framework that prioritized timing and structure over reaction. Further back in the venue, Ryan Mitchell remained in the main hall longer than he intended, observing how conversations continued around him but no longer anchored themselves to his participation. He attempted to reinsert himself into discussions regarding upcoming ventures and market positioning, yet the responses he received were increasingly procedural, as though others were no longer interpreting him as a central point of influence. Emily Carter stayed close, maintaining outward composure, but her attention occasionally drifted toward the corridor where Eva had disappeared, reflecting a growing awareness that something larger than personal perception was unfolding within the room. When Ryan finally moved toward the exit path, he did so with a slower pace than before, not due to hesitation alone, but because the environment no longer responded to him with predictable structure. At the end of the corridor, Eva and Marcus had paused near a set of glass panels overlooking the New York skyline, where city lights formed a dense pattern of motion beneath them. Marcus continued speaking in measured terms about confirmation cycles and institutional review processes, noting that certain alignments were expected to become visible across public channels within a controlled timeline. Eva listened without interruption, her expression steady, her attention focused not on individual implications but on the broader system being described. When she replied, it was with quiet certainty, acknowledging that visibility was not the beginning of change but the confirmation of what had already been structured long before it became observable. Ryan reached the edge of the corridor and stopped briefly, seeing them from a distance without being seen in return. The scene in front of him no longer resembled the social environment he had entered earlier that evening. It felt like a different layer of reality had been revealed, one that operated according to rules he had not previously recognized. Emily approached beside him, suggesting they leave, but her voice carried a subtle uncertainty, as if she too was recalibrating her understanding of the situation. Marcus concluded the exchange with Eva by acknowledging that the next stage would involve broader financial visibility across multiple oversight systems, and Eva gave a simple nod, signaling alignment without hesitation. As they began to move again, Ryan remained still for a moment longer, observing not confrontation or conflict, but the quiet restructuring of attention around individuals who no longer needed to assert influence to hold it. The evening continued behind him, but its meaning had already shifted into something less familiar, where presence no longer guaranteed relevance and recognition no longer followed expectation. The night had deepened across Manhattan, but inside the private corridors of influence that connected finance, investment, and strategic advisory circles, the movement of information had not slowed. Instead, it had become more structured, as if unseen mechanisms were quietly aligning separate streams into a single direction. Eva Johnson stood near the glass wall with Marcus Reynolds, both observing the city below in silence that felt intentional rather than empty. Marcus spoke first, his tone calm and controlled, referencing a series of coordinated confirmations that were expected to circulate through institutional review systems within the coming days. It did not elaborate beyond necessity, as if every detail already existed in a framework that required only acknowledgement rather than explanation. Ava responded with measured precision, confirming alignment without hesitation, her attention steady and unshaken, as though these developments were not new information but the continuation of something already in motion long before this night. Being them, the rhythm of the event continued, but it now felt distant, almost secondary. As conversations in the main hall shifted toward quieter discussions centered on financial outlooks and structural adjustments in corporate holdings that most attendees only partially understood. Ryan Mitchell remained inside the main space longer than necessary, his earlier confidence replaced by a slower, more analytical awareness of how attention within the room had redistributed itself. He attempted to re-establish his presence within familiar conversations, but the responses he received lacked the reinforcement he was used to, replaced instead by careful language and indirect acknowledgement. It was not rejection, but recalibration, and that distinction made it more difficult to ignore. Emily Carter stayed close, observing the changes with increasing caution, her composure intact but her certainty no longer absolute. She noticed how frequently the conversation drifted toward names and structures that no longer centered on Ryan, and how often those references subtly intersected with Marcus Reynolds in ways that suggested a broader network of influence extending beyond the social environment they were physically occupying. As Ryan eventually moved toward the corridor again, he found that the space felt less like a transition area and more like a threshold between two different understandings of the evening. When he reached the glassland section where Eva and Marcus stood earlier, he paused at a distance, observing without fully entering their space. They were no longer speaking at that moment, yet the absence of conversation did not diminish the sense of coordination between them. It felt as if communication had already occurred at a level that did not require repetition. Marcus then turned slightly, acknowledging a message on a discrete device before speaking in a low, steady tone about upcoming confirmation cycles within global investment frameworks. Ava listened without visible reaction, then gave a simple acknowledgement that confirmed readiness without requiring further detail. The interaction was brief, but its impact extended beyond the immediate moment, as if it represented a connection point within a larger structure that others were only beginning to perceive. Ryan remained still, watching the exchange without interruption, and for the first time that evening, he recognized that the dynamics shaping the room were no longer based on familiarity, recognition, or social positioning. Instead, they appeared to be governed by alignment with systems that operated independently of personal history. Emily approached him quietly, suggesting they leave, but her tone carried a level of uncertainty that reflected her own recalibration of what she had witnessed. Marcus concluded his brief exchange by acknowledging that broader visibility across financial channels would soon reflect the outcomes of ongoing coordination, and Eva responded with calm acceptance, as if the outcome was already understood. As they began to move away from the glass wall toward a more private section of the venue, Ryan remained where he stood, not because he was excluded, but because the structure of relevance around him had shifted without announcement. The evening continued, but its center of gravity had already moved elsewhere, leaving him positioned outside the framework that now defined the space. The shift that had been forming throughout the evening reached a more defined state as the gathering in Manhattan began to slowly disperse into smaller, more exclusive conversations that no longer resembled the original social structure of the event. Ava Johnson stood near the edge of a quiet corridor again, now separated from the main hall by both distance and perception, as if the environment itself had placed her in a different category of presence. Marcus Reynolds remained beside her, reviewing a brief message on his device before speaking in a low, steady tone about finalized confirmation cycles that were now moving through institutional financial channels. His language remained controlled and precise, referencing timing and alignment rather than speculation or uncertainty, as if every outcome had already been calculated and was simply waiting to be publicly acknowledged. Ava listened without interruption, then responded with calm acknowledgement, confirming readiness in a way that suggested she was not being informed but being synchronized with a process already integrated into her awareness. Meanwhile, Ryan Mitchell remained inside the main venue longer than most of the remaining guests, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet, analytical observation of how attention and conversation had redistributed across the room. He noticed that references to his presence were becoming less frequent, and when they did appear, they were increasingly procedural rather than affirming, as if his role in the environment was no longer being actively reinforced. Emily Carter stayed close, maintaining composure, but her attention followed patterns similar to his, drifting toward areas where Marcus and Eva had been seen, reflecting an unspoken awareness that the social equilibrium had shifted into something less predictable. As Ryan finally moved toward the corridor leading out of the main hall, he did so with slower steps, not from hesitation alone, but from a growing recognition that the structure of relevance within the space no longer aligned with his expectations. At the far end of the corridor, Eva and Marcus stood near a glass partition overlooking the illuminated city skyline, where the movement of New York below formed a constant, uninterrupted pattern of activity that felt distant from the stillness of their conversation. Marcus spoke briefly about upcoming visibility across financial reporting systems, noting that coordinated updates would begin appearing across multiple institutional platforms within a controlled timeframe. Ava responded with quiet certainty, acknowledging the progression without emotional emphasis, as if the transformation being described was not an event but a continuation of a system already in motion. Ryan stopped at a distance, observing them without interrupting, and for the first time that evening, he recognized that what he was witnessing was not a social exchange but a structured alignment that operated independently of personal interpretation. Emily approached him and suggested leaving, her tone careful and slightly restrained, reflecting her own recalibration of the environment they had just experienced. Marcus concluded his exchange by confirming that broader financial visibility would follow procedural completion across multiple oversight layers, and Eva gave a brief, composed acknowledgement, signaling acceptance without hesitation. As they began to move away from the glass wall, Ryan remained where he was, not excluded by force or confrontation, but repositioned by circumstance into a space outside the flow of attention that had quietly reorganized itself around other points of influence. The evening continued behind him, yet its center had already shifted, leaving him standing in a version of the night that no longer operated under the assumptions he had entered with. The night in Manhattan had reached a point of quiet resolution, where the earlier energy of the gathering no longer felt like something unfolding in real time, but rather like something already recorded and understood at a deeper level. Inside the private venue, conversations had thinned into final exchanges, polite acknowledgments, and gradual departures that left behind a space. Still glowing with controlled light but no longer driven by social momentum. Eva Johnson stood near the glass partition one final time, her presence calm and composed, as Marcus Reynolds concluded a brief exchange on his device, confirming that institutional alignment across multiple financial channels had reached the stage of public visibility preparation. His tone remained steady and without emphasis, as if the significance of what was being described existed beyond the need for emotional framing. Eva responded with a quiet acknowledgement, her expression unchanged, reflecting an understanding of timing rather than reaction. There was no celebration in the moment, only completion of a process that had been unfolding long before this evening. Being them, the remaining guests began to disperse, their conversations fragmented, their attention no longer unified around any single point of focus. Ryan Mitchell stood near the exit corridor for several seconds longer than necessary, his posture still composed, yet his internal certainty no longer reinforced by the environment around him. The recognition he had relied on earlier in the evening had dissolved gradually, replaced by a subtle but undeniable shift in how others oriented themselves within the space. Emily Carter remained beside him, her composure intact, but her silence carried a different quality now, one shaped by observation rather than participation. When Ryan finally turned toward the exit, he did so without the same confidence that had defined his earlier movements. The corridor felt longer than before, not physically but perceptually, as if the structure of the evening had expanded beyond his ability to interpret it fully. At the far end of the corridor, Eva and Marcus had already begun to move toward a private departure point, their conversation minimal, focused entirely on confirmation and timing rather than reflection. Marcus mentioned that updates would begin appearing across financial oversight systems within a controlled release cycle, and Eva acknowledged this without hesitation, her understanding aligned with a process that required no further elaboration. Ryan stopped at a distance once more, watching them as they transitioned out of view, and in that moment, he recognized that what he had experienced was not a confrontation, nor a turning point in a traditional sense, but a restructuring of relevance that had taken place without his participation. The environment around him no longer responded to his presence in the way it once had, not because of rejection, but because attention itself had shifted elsewhere in a way that could not be reversed by intent or interpretation. Emily spoke softly, suggesting they leave, and this time Ryan did not respond immediately. His gaze remained on the space where Eva had disappeared, as if attempting to reconcile the version of events he understood with the one that had quietly unfolded in parallel. When they finally moved toward the exit, the city outside continued its steady rhythm, indifferent and continuous, while behind them the evening reached its quiet conclusion, leaving only the lingering awareness that some changes do not announce themselves through disruption, but through the simple absence of what once felt permanent.